Hello, so a very warm welcome to the Secrets at the BBFC podcast. My name is Tom and I'm joined today by Lewis, of course.
Hi Tom, you alright?
Yeah, I'm doing good. How about you?
Ticking over.
Ticking over here. It's if any of you are sort of struggling with this stupid lockdown, this podcast might be a bit of like relief. So hopefully we can bring that. So let's.
Okay.
And without further ado, we can begin. So I mentioned Secrets at the BBFC in the title, but you're probably asking the question, what is the BBFC? Well, the BBFC stands for the British Board of Film Classification. In 2012, when the UK started using PEGI instead. And here's an interesting question I want to put to you. So, did you know that when you go to the cinema to watch a movie, you might not be seeing the version the director wanted you to see? So, Lewis, tell us about why this is the case, why people can't necessarily watch what the director wants to see.
What do you mean by that, Tom?
So I mean, how come, what does the BBFC do that means that people can't see the full movie?
Because it's been edited for a wider audience or to suit people's sensibilities.
Exactly. The BBFC edit stuff. Now, this might come as a bit of a surprise to some of you viewers, but unfortunately, it's something that happens on a regular basis, although not quite as much as the sort of 80s and 90s. So the BBFC censors things, but what kind of things does it censor? Well, it can censor all kinds of material. It can censor violence, bad language, drug misuse, sex, all of these different aspects that some people might find too sensitive for a particular age rating. And I'd say the BBFC is quite open with its decisions. So would you like to add something to that, Lewis?
That's where the public consultations come in, right?
Yeah.
So it's a bit like a referendum, because in a referendum, people vote for a particular party, MP or Prime Minister, and when a majority gets that, when that thing gets the majority, it means that the public really wanted that thing to happen, which is called democracy. And as long as the public really want that particular thing in an age rating, it's called democracy. And democracy is a big thing in this world, isn't it? Which is the majority being happy.
It certainly is. And it's
we should be striving towards that.
Yeah, definitely. So with the public consultation exercises, these take place roughly every 4 to 5 years. So the last one was in 2018, I believe. And these public consultation exercises help to, as the BBFC term it, shape their guidelines. So it helps them to decide which material is suitable at a particular age category and which material isn't. And you might be wondering, well, how are cuts made? So cuts can be made at 2 stages of the BBFC. One is the advice stage, which is probably the most common sector where cuts happen, and the other is the formal stage. So the advice stage is when the distributor will submit an unfinished or finished version of the film to the BBFC in order to see what particular certificate that film might achieve, and the distributors can tinker the film accordingly. With the formal stage, the film's already finished and in its full form, and it's much more noticeable to the public, let's say, than perhaps with cuts at the advice stage. You'll see that if you search up a film that has been pre-cut at the advice stage, you'll see it under pre-cuts information. But if it's been cut at the formal stage, you will see the words cuts information. And cuts instead of pre-cuts tend to be quite noticeable to the public, as opposed to pre-cutting the film at the advice stage. So I suppose the next question I want to ask viewers is why it's relevant. So Lewis, you want to talk about why you think it's relevant to discuss this?
Discuss what, Tom?
Why it's relevant that people are aware of censorship by the BBFC.
So they can voice their opinions on whether they agree with it or not, because it's a very subjective process, Tom. As I've just said, some people would agree that this cut is right, while some would think it's too stuffy. And another thing to mention is, as soon as they know what's been cut from a film, they won't get confused by the story, for example. And another thing is whether that person will think it's suitable for their kids to watch, because even the slightest cut to get that certain rating still wouldn't be suitable for their kids to watch.
I suppose I'd say one example of what you could call a family film back in the 80s and 90s is that's achieved BBFC notoriety, let's say, is Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Now, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves was censored for a PG rating back in 1991. The cuts included violence and even removing the film's sole use of strong language.
The F word.
Yeah, the F word, because of course the F word isn't permitted at PG anymore in any form.
And it's the worst word in the English language because it means a sexual activity, which I totally understand. That's no big deal.
Yeah, it certainly is probably the most commonly used swear word in the English language. But it's interesting. I'd like to point out the fact that Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, whilst being censored for its cinema release, was actually censored further for video release because it received enough complaints from parents that the BBFC decided that the cinema version passed was no longer acceptable at PG, and therefore further changes had to be made. So I guess this comes back to your point about democracy, Lewis, because arguably the BBFC's process with cutting is less democratic, you could argue nowadays, because it doesn't always take into account parents' requests, whereas with the 80s and 90s you had multiple films that were being censored for their cinema release and then further censored after complaints. So would you say that the cutting process is less democratic nowadays?
Maybe they could do a little vote, for example, from a certain group of people, for example, and And if that vote means there's no need to cut it, then there's no need to cut it. But if the majority votes for the opposite would cut it, then cut it. But as long as the cut isn't noticeable.
Yeah. Indeed, cuts being noticeable is obviously probably one of the worst things in terms of the continuity of a film.
That ruins the film for everybody. Isn't fair.
Yeah, it does. I couldn't agree with you more. It does at times make the film quite jumpy, and I'd say one recent example of this is Maze Runner: The Scorch Trials, which was censored by the BBFC for a 12A rating. And The Scorch Trials, in its censored form, has some quite noticeable jump cuts, particularly during the sequences involving the Cranks, which are these zombified creatures that have been infected with this particular virus. Particularly sequences with them, they seem quite jumpy, and this makes the cuts much more noticeable, and it ruins the flow of the film, not just for younger children, but also for older people who would have been fine seeing it even without cuts. So I suppose there is a point to be made in older people not wanting changes to be made because they would be fine anyway. So the BBFC can seem to be a dictatorial organization somewhat, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Lewis?
Well, the film classification board in India, they're probably worse. Because
they are probably worse.
India can count as India can count as a dictatorship, much like North Korea, the United Arab Emirates, and Thailand, for instance. So their values would be more formal and conservative. So I think the BBFC can have its fair share of moments, but the Indian classification board's up to 11.
Yeah, the BBFC is certainly much less dictatorial in its methods than, for instance, the UK, in India. I mean, sorry, not the UK. I just said that twice. But let's swiftly move on. So the next point I want to talk about is recent tendencies by the BBFC, and there are two particular aspects that I'd want to mention. So the first aspect, I guess, is domestic abuse. And I highlight domestic abuse because the BBFC has recently toughened up on it, particularly at junior categories. And this is what has caused the highly anticipated but not quite as well performed as hoped Tenet to be censored for its UK release. And the sequence involved was a scene in which a man beats his wife whilst she is lying on the ground. And I can probably understand the changes. I haven't seen the clips, but it's an understandable change, and annoying, but understandable. And it was done after research by the BBFC into how domestic violence should be portrayed in films. So what are your thoughts on it, Lewis?
It can also be to do with woke culture, right? For society to be more aware and understanding of taboo issues that are more social, such as domestic abuse, racism, sexism, and even how certain minorities are portrayed. And with the scene in Tenet where Sator is beating up Kat, it can bring those memories back to a domestic survivors of domestic abuse back into their head.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
I cut out again.
Oh no, it's fine. No, it's fine. Go. Keep going.
So I was saying, the hot topic issues such as domestic abuse. Say if a survivor of that kind of abuse watched the film Tenet in its uncut form, it may bring back those memories when they had that sort of treatment, and it may cause severe distress, much like the Dunblane shootings where they edited a Leonardo DiCaprio film and a parent may have those memories of that mass shooting come back into their head, which is the same reason.
So for those of you who didn't know what Lewis was talking about with the Leonardo DiCaprio film, the film was called Basketball Diaries, and although the UK cinema release was uncut, the UK video release was censored to remove a scene in which a man shoots several children in response to the tragic Dunblane massacre, which claimed multiple lives. So it's important for the BBFC to be aware of political sensibilities, but there are instances where one could argue that it goes too far. So, and I'd say this issue of the BBFC going too far is exemplified by none other than Rambo 3. So Rambo 3 was intended to be a very standard action flick of the 1980s, but of course it was censored by the BBFC even for an 18 rating due to the Hungerford massacre that took place months prior to the film, in which a lone man shot and wounded several people in the town of Hungerford in Berkshire, England. And the BBFC saw fit to toughen up its policy on weapons and violence at adult categories. And one examiner even remarked at the time that it is naive to believe that the BBFC can act without regard to political realities. Indeed, I would go further and argue that it is irresponsible. But it seems that when I was mentioning about the BBFC going too far, what I meant by that was that the BBFC was censoring material that would almost certainly have been permissible at 18 uncut, if not 15 with cuts, for instance. And it just seems like a knee-jerk reaction to political sensibilities, which is probably something the BBFC could avoid for now, particularly with the woke culture that Lewis mentioned and other issues that have arisen. So I mentioned domestic abuse. I suppose the next issue I want to bring up is the discrepancy between categories 15 and 18 by the BBFC. Now, if you've watched several 15 rated films in the past, you're probably aware that the BBFC has become unusually lenient towards particular areas like violence in the 15 categories. And it seems that this trend isn't stopping, but with a consultation only a few years away, it seems that the BBFC will probably have quite a few complaints on their hands with regards to these particular films that have been quite strong. So, Lewis, what do you want to say about the BBFC's difference between 15 and 18?
So 15 is meant to be for older teenagers, while 18's for adults only. And for a fifth, I think for something like violence, Tom, if certain weapons are unavailable by law, then the rage rate should be lowered because it's less likely it will be copied. And but let's say back in the 1980s, when those weapons were available, then the toughening up of those ratings is justified. And I think the age ratings are okay at the moment. I think the violence in an 18 rated film in some of them can be over a 15.
What do you mean? Sorry, what do you mean by that? What was that last
If
what was that
certain
last question?
Because so in some 18 rated films, the violence is justified in an 18, whereas in one or two, maybe a 15 would be okay, because number one, people may be desensitized by violence, particularly in cartoons, other films, and video games. Whereas if it looks more realistic, then 18 would be okay if it's in the worst case scenario. Because violence has been around for ages. You're doing the Crusades, World War II, the 9/11 attacks, and even gang culture. I would say violence is probably my most big issue if I had to choose.
I would argue that it is too, and the BBFC has quite strange policies at times when it comes to violence. So there have been many films that have been passed at 15, such as Kick-Ass, for instance, that would have been very heavily edited for a 15 rating. Or even an 18 rating if released in the 1980s or the 1990s, because, of course, James Furman, the director, was known for being particularly harsh on his policies towards violence and language. So you've got films like Kick-Ass that have, although clearly comical and unrealistic in nature, are still quite strong. And then you've got films that are more realistic, such as The Equalizer and The Equalizer 2, that have had to be edited for a 15 rating on both occasions, but later passed uncut with an 18 rating for 4K UHD releases. I suppose that's one thing that is sometimes quite annoying with BBFC censorship, is that uncut versions tend to be released on 4K UHD now, which is as of yet quite a niche format and one that people might not necessarily have access to. So in a way, that's quite a shame, because the director potentially cannot get their chance to show their movie as originally intended. So I suppose that's another question that I'd want to raise, is the creative freedom of the director and how they are able to showcase it. So Lewis, do you want to talk about the creative freedoms of the director?
So if a director wanted this particular film to be realistic, because say he was making a war film and the war film had this much violence in real life, and to flanderize that real life scenario would be a bit too personal for the director. They want it to be seen as that kind of violence. But then parents and other people are complaining that it's too realistic for them, and that also comes under freedom of speech, which is the right to disagree, the right to say what you feel. But there's also but there's no freedom of consequence. So if a particular film is too provocative in that sense, then the consequence would be backlash.
And of course that was a particularly big issue with Tenet. I have heard some reports that say that Tenet would probably have been passed uncut if it was released before 2020, but of course it wasn't, and the film suffered changes. So with regards to the creative freedoms of the director, it does come down to either the greater good of making money or the director
greater
actually
good of society.
Yeah, or the director getting to showcase what they want. And I'd say I don't want to keep going on this for far too long, but I'd say a final point I'd want to mention is the issue of banning films today, because there have been no less than 3 incidences of bannings and cuttings even at the 18 level in recent times. Those were 3 horror movies which were all either cut or banned because of issues with sexual violence. And it does raise the question that if the film is so easily accessible in today's society, why are the BBFC still censoring these films? So, Lewis, do you want to talk about that?
Well, Tom, sexual violence isn't a joke either. There are many people even in countries, like gang-ridden countries such as Brazil, that do get raped. And raped can be an uncomfortable experience, but showing it on screen, I'm just trying my best to describe it, Tom. If it's something really horrific, such as sexual violence, and nearly to the point where it's a snuff film, and bans would need to be made. And then the same with animal cruelty, because animals are defenseless than we are human, and by doing animal cruelty in a realistic manner by using a real animal, then it would to get removed, because that's also illegal.
Yeah, and on the subject of animal cruelty, the BBFC has always carried a policy, according to the 1937 Cinematograph Animals Act, which means that animals cannot be realistically harmed in real life on screen. This has resulted in many instances of horse trips. For instance, that's quite a common instance that the BBFC has removed, but has also resulted in a lot of other different cuts to the real life deaths of many animals. I'd say there are at least 2 key exceptions to this are Apocalypse Now and Old Boy. So Apocalypse Now was a 1979 war film directed by Francis Ford Coppola, the famous film director, and this featured a sequence in which a real buffalo is slaughtered with a machete, and this sequence was particularly troubling for the BBFC because it was an instance of real life violence, but they also took into account that the slaughtering of the buffalo was a ritualistic killing rather than one purely orchestrated for the film. And this is what happened to help the film be passed uncut. Similar with Old Boy, this features a sequence in which, yes, this might sound disgusting, a live octopus is eaten by a man. Now, I think it was quite a notoriously difficult sequence to watch back in 2003 when it was released. But the reason the BBFC didn't ban it or cut it was because octopi are invertebrates and they are not covered by the 1937 Cinematograph Animals Act legislation. And that's why the film was classified 18 uncut, and no cuts to animal cruelty were made. So it seems that the BBFC, particularly in these areas, has become quite strange with their logic, particularly with animal cruelty. It's a difficult issue, but I would say that since the killings are quite old, it seems somewhat illogical to keep cutting them. But that's not to say that I'm anti-animal. It's just that sometimes you can't achieve things without a degree of realism in your film. But
what about the 1930 something Animals Act? If a film was made after that law was passed, that's another thing.
Yeah. I was discussing that. It was the 1937 Cinematograph Animals Act, and it's interesting because right after the Animals Act, several films that included horse trips were actually passed uncut. It wasn't until the 80s and 90s that these films started to be censored for their material. So hopefully you found this first podcast quite enlightening. In future podcasts, I'll be discussing other issues. I think I'll probably start with junior categories. That seems like a good place to start. So I hope you enjoyed listening to this podcast. I hope it's been an enlightening experience. Thanks to Lewis for joining me, of course.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
No problem. So it's been a good first episode, and I wish you all the best. And that's it for me. Goodbye.